move on to framing questions. And the first thing is, there are an infinite number of questions you can think of in ornithology or ecology or biology or science, questions that can be asked. And when it comes to, and those of you who have been through a process where, as part of your work, your course, you had to think of a question, let's say for a thesis or something, I think most of us have this common experience that it's very confusing. You don't know where to start. How is it that your professor says, go think of a research question that you'll answer in your thesis, and you're like, what does that mean? I don't know what to do. So I'm going to try and break it down a little bit. Give you some characteristics of a good sort of research question, but also some tips for how you might begin and then narrow down all the possible ideas until you arrive at a question that you can answer. So we've talked about this before. Some people divide research into these pure and applied boxes. We might say that this is an artificial distinction, but in truth, many scientists and researchers do fall in one or the other bin. And it's sort of whether you are asking basic questions or applied questions depends in a sense on your motivation. Why are you in this? Why are you in this classroom? Why are you interested in birds? Why are you doing science? Are you here because you want to discover truths about the universe, about birds? Do you want to contribute to some fundamental questions about, for example, what regulates populations, or why do females choose mates in some species, and why do males choose females in other species? Are you interested in those kinds of questions, to advance knowledge and understanding? And on the other hand, I'm crudely putting it this way, on the other hand, are you motivated by a desire to change the world? You want to change the world for the better in your perception of what the better is. And in our case, you want to change the world might be, are you really motivated by, the desire to keep as much biodiversity extant, alive, and not allow extinctions to happen? Are you motivated by, if you're an agricultural scientist, you might be motivated to try and solve problems of malnutrition, right? You want to change the world. So in the first case, very crudely, in the first case you want to enhance the understanding of the world. In the second case, you want to change the world. They are not, as you can imagine, as you can see, not that different from each other as people normally say. If you want to change the world, typically you also need to understand the world. But it's also true that if you start with an applied question, you will ask different questions about understanding the world than you would if you, for example, you might not, if you started with a conservation question, you might not, the first thing that comes to your mind might not be why do females choose these particular mates. It might be, but in some cases there's a relationship between these questions and conservation. But you might be more interested in, okay, can I figure out what are the major causes of extinction or major causes of conservation problems? Is it about habitat change? Is it about toxicity? Is it about disease? And then you'll go further and ask questions about those. Yeah? So for all of you, I think when you're trying to narrow down a question, one thing that helps is for you to think, do I want to find out more about the world for its own sake? Do I want to find out more about the world in order to make some positive change? And then you might follow different trajectories from there. Another way of, and these are not really separate, but they're just a few different ways in which you can think about asking questions. You can ask yourself, what level of organization am I particularly interested in? Based on what I've studied and what I've read and so on, am I interested in things that are happening within organisms? Yeah, not things like genetics and developmental biology and so on, which people study in birds. I'm interested in physiology, hormones, how hormones control migration or behavior and other things like that, or how hormones control growth and reproduction and so on. I might also be interested instead at the level, not within the individual, but the level of the individual itself, so behavior or morphology. So this is sub-organismal, and now we're getting to organismal biology, which is at the level of the individual. I'm fascinated with behavior. I'm fascinated with morphology. Why does anatomy and plumage and so on vary across species or across individuals in the same species? That might be something you're interested in. Also happening at the individual level is how birds might make decisions about when to lay eggs and how many eggs to lay and how much to feed the chicks and so on. Remembering again the discussion that these decisions we're using as a shorthand, we don't really believe necessarily that individual birds are consciously making decisions. So that comes in life history. Then when we aggregate individuals together, there are new phenomena that are worth studying at the population level. We want to know about births and deaths and immigration, dispersal. We want to know how these processes combine so that populations grow or decline or stay stable, and how do all those things work. So we might be interested at the population level. If we combine multiple populations, we're looking at entire species. And you might ask questions at the species level and so on. When we put species together, we have communities. If we look at larger geographical scales, we might have landscapes. We have even larger scales, ecosystems. We can ask interesting questions about birds or biology in general at any one of these scales, and even beyond that, input things like biogeography and so on, macroecology. So that's another way in which you can try and look at those heads and say, you know, what am I really interested in? Suborganismal biology, avian biology. Am I interested at the organism level? Am I interested at the population level or the community level, and so on? And that maybe combined with your motivation over here can help you begin to narrow down what you might like to look at. And then, just as an observation of many master students over the years, I know that some students just come with an obsession with certain topics. Some students are obsessed with a particular species. I don't recall a student obsessed with a particular bird species, but there's a student who was obsessed with something called a honey badger. There's one particular species, very elusive, and he said, I don't care what I do for my master species, but it will be on this species. I don't care where, I don't care what, it will be on this species alone. Okay? That's legitimate. I mean, I'm not, you know, that's fair enough. Some people love particular ecosystems, depending on maybe their experience when they grew up. Some people love rainforests. So I'm always fascinated by rainforests. They might have never been to a rainforest, but they might have seen, no, it's not a, they might have seen, you know, on TV and just been fascinated, you know. Or they might have grown up in a, let's say, around a river, right? And they say these riparian systems are just fascinating. They are dynamic, they flow, they flood. I really want to know about these. Yeah, could be places. There was another student I knew who was obsessed with one particular place. This Satyamangalam Tigers are in Tamil Nadu. He grew up just outside Satyamangalam, spent all his childhood roaming around and all his youth roaming around that place. And said, I don't care what species I study or what phenomenon or process, but I will do it here, in this place. Fair enough. I'm just telling you what, you know, people have done and said. You might be interested in, you know, slightly broader ideas. What I mean by processes or phenomena, like you might be interested in competition. I'm interested in the phenomenon of competition. It's such an interesting phenomena. In conventional evolutionary biology, competition is thought to be an extremely strong force shaping species and communities. You might take the opposite side. People study competition a lot. I'm really interested in mutualisms, where species benefit each other. And there are so many examples of mutualisms, but it's really understudied because everybody studies competition. So I want to study mutualisms. Now let me find out what is a appropriate system in which I can study mutualisms. Is it cleaner fish and their clients? Is it you know, birds and the flowers that they pollinate, or birds and the trees whose fruits they disperse? And I might go that way, right? So I start with the mutualism, and then I see what's the appropriate system in which I can study this. You might be motivated by conservation, as we just talked about, and in some cases, and I would recommend this, you try not to go this way. In some cases, people have learned particular tools, particular techniques of doing things, and they say, I've learned this technique, what question can I ask where this technique can be applied? And the reason I say, you know, try to fight that tendency a little bit is that in an idealized world, what you do as a scientist, as a researcher, should be driven by the question that you have. And if that question requires you to learn some tools or techniques, or if they're very complicated techniques, maybe it requires you to collaborate with somebody who knows those techniques, then to my mind that's a better way of doing it. So I'll just give you some idea, some examples of these tools techniques. One thing that came up very early on in the 90s was GIS. Once GIS started on the scene, everybody's like, GIS, have you got to learn GIS? And it's a tool in your toolkit as a scientist. But then we tended to have these GIS experts. And the GIS experts would then cast around for a question, so what question can I answer using GIS? So GIS became the starting point, and everything was subordinate to that technique. And there are other kinds of things. And I can see how people do this. For example, some people use molecular techniques. And they say, okay, now I know something about how I can use DNA and similarities and differences in DNA, so let me see what questions can I ask using this. Yeah? And I have some sympathy because sometimes it takes a long time to learn these techniques. Some people, famously in ecology, are you learn this distance sampling, line transect that Umesh talked about. In the past, there used to be some people who, I'm a distance sampler, I'm a line transect distance sampler. What question can I ask where I can use line transect and distance sampling? And increasingly now, there are very complicated statistical techniques to do some things. There's this thing called occupancy. Did Umesh talk about occupancy? Did you talk about occupancy? Anyway, it's another way of understanding how animals and plants are distributed in space. And some of the modeling of that can be, the statistical modeling can be very complicated. And so once you've learned that, you're like, I've learned this, I'm an expert in this statistical technique, so I'm going to see where I can apply this statistical technique. Yeah? Fair enough, it's your choice. I'm just saying that you consider trying to start from the question and then seeing what tools you need. When you are coming to framing a question in ornithology or ecology, remember by ecology I mean evolution, ecology and behavior, broadly speaking. I think that this is a useful hierarchy to follow, and I'll describe what this is one by one. So, we start with what's your motivation? Why are you in this game at all? Right? And here's an example. This is not the only motivation. I'm just giving an example of somebody's possible motivation. Your motivation to do science is so you can make a difference, so that to create a world in which humans and wildlife can coexist. That's just one example of a kind of motivation. You might have other sorts of things. I want to solve the mysteries of the universe. Might be a very broad motivation. I want to be the first one who understands really why there are these patterns of species across the globe. Nobody really understands in great detail about it. So that's all fine. That's your sort of life motivation. Why you are in science in the first place. But now you are have to do a project. You have to do, let's say, a master's thesis, and you have to come down from that lofty level, and you have to begin tackling real things that you can now get your teeth into, because that's not something that you can. The motivation is not something you can achieve in the space of 6 months of a master's thesis, right? Or maybe many people working all together can still not achieve that. So when you come down to your particular project, or your master's thesis or PhD, whatever, you frame what I call a goal. A goal is something that's achievable within the time frame that you have, the time and the resources that you have. And I've phrased this a little broadly, but actually the goal will be more specific. It will be in the context of something more specific. For example, I know that in Uttarakhand, there are these community-owned forests where the communities that manage them, they extract resources. They lop branches and take fodder and take resources from them. And at the same time in these forests, there are these really valuable group of birds, woodpeckers, that live in these forests. Yeah? And I want to understand whether it's possible to reconcile the needs of communities for the fodder and other resources, and the needs of woodpeckers in terms of the habitat and so on that they require to be able to survive. And so I have a feeling that there must be so there's extraction, but there must be some level of extraction below which woodpeckers can survive fine. And there is probably some level of extraction above which that will have a long-term effect a negative effect on the woodpeckers. And that point, which divides the below and above, that would be, let's say, a sustainable use, sustainable extraction of resources, where both the people's needs can be met, as well as the woodpeckers as a group, as a guild, can be met. So I've just put this in shorthand, but it's much more specific than that. I want to understand levels of extraction in these community forests that are sustainable with respect to the conservation of woodpecker the woodpecker populations. Okay, so that's the actual goal of mine. I didn't want to write it all out over here. Now from this goal, and this assessment of sustainable extraction levels is what I want to achieve at the end of my study. If it's not achievable at the end of my study, I have to reframe the goal. I have to make my goal less ambitious. Okay, so your goal should be something that you feel you have a good chance of achieving at the end of your study. Whether you're studying 6 months or 3 years, you have to adjust the ambition of your goal accordingly. Now from this goal, we derive some more specific questions, which I'm going to call objectives. And these are objectives that, there are multiple objectives that you will have to achieve, you'll have to address in order to achieve your goal. So for example, objective number 1 would be what are the levels of extraction? I just want to know, if I compare across these different community forests, what are the levels, what is happening? Right? I'm going in for the first time, I don't know what's happening, I just want to know what's happening. That's an example of an objective, right? And this now has become quite specific. Yeah? It's fairly specific. Yeah? Objective 2 might be, given the variation in extraction, what is the relationship between the species, that is, the number of individuals of different woodpeckers in different community forests that have different levels of extraction, right? So I go out and measure not just the extraction levels, but I also measure using line transects or point clouds and all the wonderful methods you've heard. I'm trying to understand what is the population density of the different species of woodpeckers in this level, in these different levels of extraction. So that could be another objective. Now, I'm just going to go through, because the last level in this hierarchy is the specific tasks you need to carry out in order to meet the objective, right? So if this was my objective, what is the relationship between species and extraction? Here are some examples of what the tasks might be. Now the tasks tell you exactly what I have to do on the ground, right? So task number 1 is, I need to establish plots at different extraction levels, yeah? So that's a typical technique used for measuring vegetation and other aspects of biodiversity. And of course, the question remains, how? And there are many elements to how. How means, where am I going to put those plots? What are the characteristics? Should they be square or circular, and of what size? Right? How many plots should I have? All this is putting in the how, and we're not going to address those right now. In each of these plots, I need to measure extraction levels. Okay? Maybe I'm looking at the trees, and trees, when they are locked, you can see the signs that the branches have been cut. So perhaps I'll measure extraction levels that way. I look at, on average, what's the number of average number of branches that are cut. So I have to say, I've got my plot, now I have to do something in that plot. What is it that I do? Okay, so that's my task number 2. And let's say task number 3 is, now I need to measure my woodpeckers. Right? And I've abbreviated this way. Woodpeckers probably won't be measured just in those plots. You're hardly going to see a woodpecker in a 10-meter radius plot. But you have to use point counts or line transects or something like that. So again, the question arises, how? And I need to make sure, this might not be an exhaustive list, but I need to make sure that if I carry out task 1, 2, and 3, and with some data analysis and so on, I should be able to meet this objective. If the tasks are not sufficient to meet the objective, I have to find out what the missing tasks are and carry those out as well. And this is all part of the planning process. Does that make sense? Yeah? So all the tasks should be both necessary and sufficient to meet the objective. And, I've got some other things I'm going to ignore for now. And these might not be the only 2 objectives. Maybe my objective 3 is about what demographic rate. So for example, just because there are woodpeckers in more or less abundance doesn't allow me to understand why there are more woodpeckers in some places than others. So by demographic rates, I mean things like, is it that the clutch size is different? Or is it that the survival of the young is different in different extraction levels? Or is it that the predation is higher or lower? And so survival and reproduction are the 2 main demographic parameters which can be broken up further. So if I'm more ambitious, I might ask what these rates are what rates are affected. And then just like I asked myself, are these tasks necessary and sufficient to meet the objective? I need to ask, are these 3 objectives taken together, once I've fulfilled them, Are they necessary and sufficient to meet my goal? So the details of this you can work out. This is the way in which I approach things. It's not like this is a textbook thing, everybody describes it this way, but I found it useful for myself and for some of the students that I've worked with to think of this trajectory as a kind of useful hierarchy in which to think about it. We always start with broad thoughts, we have to narrow them down until we have something that is achievable in the time we have available, and then we have to break that down into further objectives that taken together will allow us to reach our goal. Does that make sense? Yeah. So then it's quite abstract. I've tried to put it in the context of a single example, and then I'm hoping that you can at least vaguely see how you might be able to, think of your ideas and your study system in this in this framework as well. Any questions about this particular slide? Yes. Thank goodness, one question.
So the goal is our research question, right? In all the hierarchy.
Yeah. And the thing is, sorry, just to say that when somebody says, "What's your research question?" there's no definition of what that is. So I can think of the goal as a question, or I can think of the objective as a question. We don't have a common definition of when I say question, what it means. So that's why I've tried to actually remove the word question in this and make it explicit that the goal is the overall thing that I want to achieve, and then what is it that I need to do in order to achieve that overall goal. But yeah, broadly speaking, we might consider the goal is our overall question,
and we can break down.
And the objectives are our sub-questions that are needed to answer that overall question. This is kind of the cycle of doing science typically. So as I said, we might have a goal, the goal of our study overall. From that goal we derive multiple, let's call them questions, I call them objectives before. They don't have to be multiple, but typically there are multiple objectives, multiple questions. From each of those questions or objectives, maybe we have to come up with a hypothesis, because if our objective, for example, is to figure out who killed this person, or to figure out what controls tiger populations or what controls pigeon populations, we might have to come up with hypotheses, maybe. If we come up with hypotheses, we will have to deduce predictions. That's why it's a hypothetical deductive method. We deduce predictions from those hypotheses. And if we make predictions, then we have to figure out how to test those predictions. How can we collect the evidence that will allow us to see whether those predictions match the evidence or not? Or if we don't have any hypotheses, if we just have to directly observe the world, we don't have to worry about this. We just want to know how many tigers there are, how many pigeons and how many falcons there are, how many woodpeckers there are. Then we go straight from our question straight to the tasks. There's no intervening hypotheses and so on. Either way, we have those tasks that we have to carry out, and the carrying out those tasks involve designing the study. So we said we put plots, but where do we put plots? Right? How do we scatter these plots across the landscape? How many plots should we have? What kind of plot should they be, square, circular, whatever? And what should we do in those plots? Right? All that comes under study design. Then once we've designed our study, we know what tasks to carry out, we go and collect the data. We collect the data typically on data sheets. Sometimes people use digital recorders and things like that. So sometimes people directly collect on a little computer or device. Then after collecting the data, we need to sort of collate and make sure that we check for errors and various things, put the data typically in a spreadsheet. And then once that's done, we analyze the data. So this is where the statistics comes in. And we do, or hopefully don't do, this null hypothesis significance testing. We make lots of graphs. We look at patterns in the graphs. Is there a relationship in the graph? Or we make maps. We do all kinds of, lots and lots of different kinds of efforts come under the broad description of analyzing data. And then we have that analysis with us, and we have to interpret what it means, what all the analysis means, and we want to interpret those results such that we can say something about our goal, right? Interpretation is not in any direction. interpretation is in light of what we wanted to achieve, what is this analysis telling us? Correct? So it has to form this full circle, right? That's a typical process. Don't lose sight of the fact that you started out with this goal and you need to come back to that goal. This, by the way, is kind of similar to the way which you write a scientific paper, you write a thesis. You start very broad. This is my motivation. This is what the literature says, a broad overview. Then you will say, however, what we don't know and what's really vital to know is this aspect. Okay, so motivation up there. This aspect we need to know about. In order to understand this aspect, we need to do certain things. So here we come to our methods, and the methods now spell out, the tasks in study design. The methods spell out how we collected the data. The methods spell out how we analyze the data. Then we have the results, where we show the results of the analysis. And then, so that's just your little bit. And then we need to interpret the results and come back and say, what have we learned? So then you start broad, come down narrow, and then you broaden out again. Broaden out to say what it is now that we have learned from this and what implications does it have for the larger understanding of whatever it is you're studying. So the logic of a scientific paper or a thesis, something like that, pretty much follows this same kind of flow. So it's very useful to sort of internalize it in some way. And I'll also, before we move on to study design, I'll also say one last thing about this, is that we too often, we think of each of these sequentially. So when I'm planning the study, I'll think of the goal and the questions and so on. Then I'll say, wow, now I need to go and collect data. So you go and collect data, and you analyze the data. And from the analysis, you realize, oh, that's very interesting. I see some particular pattern. And in your paper, thesis, you now think of hypotheses that explain the pattern, right? And that's backwards. You can't see a pattern in your data and then invent a hypothesis that's consistent with that, and then say, I've proven this hypothesis, or it's consistent with the hypothesis, right? There you are just generating ideas. You're not actually testing the hypothesis. And that's actually dishonest. You can't do that, although nobody teaches us that's dishonest. Only if you have a pre-specified hypothesis that you're testing are you allowed to state that in your thesis. Only if it's pre-specified. That I had this hypothesis, and I derived these predictions, and I collected the data, and the data is consistent or not consistent. If you're using your data to come up with new hypotheses, you should say that. You say that I find this very fascinating pattern. I had no idea that it would arise. This raises new questions that need to be answered in new research. Okay, does that make any sense to you? But very often, people pretend, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or unconsciously, pretend that there was a pre-specified hypothesis that they were testing, but actually none of that was the case. Yeah, so that's that. So then you analyze your data and interpret the results. And very often I've seen that people go out and collect the data, and then they say, they'll come to me or somebody else, and they say, okay, I've got all this data, how do I analyze it? Not done. Not done. You must think about the analysis as part of the entire planning process. As part of the entire planning process. To answer this goal, let's say I know, for example, the woodpecker situation, I know that I need to make a graph. I need to make a graph of level of extraction and density of woodpeckers. I know I need to make a graph like this. So always when you are thinking about your questions and your objectives and your goals, think about, and it's much, to my mind, it's much better to think about what graphs you have to draw rather than what statistics you're going to apply. Whether you do a t-test or Mann-Whitney test or regression or correlation or whatever like that, that's not so interesting or important to me. More important is how you're going to visualize the data, how you're going to look at the data, not what numbers you're going to calculate. And if you think about it, you will realize, oh yes, for this particular question, this is the kind of graph I need to draw. For this particular question, I need to make a map like this. You won't know what the graph will look like, but you know there will be an XY graph. Huh? And you might also know that if this prediction is true, then I'll get a positive relationship. If it's not true, it will be flat. And if it's the opposite, it will be negative. So you can imagine different possible outcomes. Do all that before you go and collect data. Because there are limitations and there are complications to analysis of data. And very often those limitations and complications can be dealt with in the study design part of it. I can't tell you how many times people have come to me and said, I've got this data, please help me analyze it. And I say, okay, what was your question to begin with? They say, this was your question. And I look at the data, I look at the study design and say that this cannot be used to answer that question. Because there's some confounding variable, or there's something you've not taken into account, or because it's simply collected in the wrong way to answer that particular goal. So you can't just trust in the future and say that I'll just go ahead and do it and something will work out. It just doesn't work and you'll be disappointed. So please do think about the entire cycle in as much detail as possible, and revise, keep revising. Say, oh, this analysis won't work. I need to do a different kind of analysis. For a different kind of analysis, what sort of data do I need to collect? In what way do I need to collect it? Say, okay, now suppose I revise my study design, then okay, now I think this is going to work. Or you'll say that it's impossible to design a study like this. That means my question is too ambitious. I cannot answer this question. And if you know in advance through the logic that you cannot answer that question, then don't even try. Then say, okay, I'm going to actually narrow the scope of my goal because I know I can't answer that question at the time I have available. So let me narrow the scope of the goal so that I can actually meet that goal. And say, okay, so that question is thrown out. Now I have the remaining questions. Taken together, what do these remaining questions tell me about the goal? So rephrase things. And then you go over this again and again and again. You say, okay, now as far as I can tell, this is pretty watertight. Of course, there may be floods, and of course there may be no fruiting and all those sorts of things. But at least in terms of the logic and the process, you will be as prepared as possible. And you won't be stuck with after collecting data and then go running around to different people and say, how do I analyze this data? You should already have that at least roughly in your mind.